I was 71 years old the day my son walked into my house without knocking and demanded $300,000 to pay his wife's debt. Not asked, demanded, as if I were a bank teller and he was making a withdrawal from an account that was rightfully his. "Because you owe it to us," he said. The son I had sacrificed everything for. That rainy afternoon, as I looked into the cold eyes of my daughter-in-law standing in my doorway, I realized a devastating truth. I wasn't their family anymore. I was their bank account, their insurance policy, their secret keeper. What would you do if the people who should love you most treated you like nothing but a solution to their problems? When my son uttered those chilling words, "If you don't pay, Olivia might kill herself, and that would be on you, Mom," I made a decision that would change everything. You see, Olivia had a secret, a dark, blood-stained secret that I had protected for years, and someone was threatening to expose it, to bring the truth into the light after 12 long years of silence. This is a story about family betrayal, buried secrets, and the impossible choices we make in the name of love. About what happens when a woman who has given everything finally decides to take something back, her dignity. Follow my journey as I walk away from everything I've ever known and discover that sometimes surviving is the most beautiful form of revenge. If you're watching this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. I was 71 years old the day my son walked into my house without even knocking. It was a rainy afternoon in Scranton, Pennsylvania, the kind where the clouds hang so low they seem to press down on your very soul. I just pulled a batch of snickerdoodles from the oven, Martha's recipe, the one I'd been using for 40-odd years. The scent of cinnamon and sugar still filled my small kitchen, wrapping around the walls like a warm hug. But there was nothing warm about Derek's face when he barged in. His forehead was slick with sweat despite the chill, his tie askew, and his usually meticulously combed hair disheveled as if he'd been running his fingers through it for hours. Standing behind him, not even crossing the threshold of my home, was Olivia. My daughter-in-law of 12 years had her arms folded tightly across her designer blouse, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her own flesh. Those eyes. I'll never forget those eyes. From the day Derek brought her home, Olivia had always looked at me like I was something she'd found stuck to the bottom of her expensive shoes. A burden, a moral obligation she endured for the sake of family appearances. The wealthy banker's daughter who'd married down into a teacher's family and never let anyone forget the sacrifice. But that day, that rainy Tuesday in October, she wasn't looking at me with her usual contempt. No, this was different. She was looking at me the way a prosecutor looks at a witness they're about to break, like she was waiting for a confession. "Mom," Derek said, not bothering with hello. His voice had a tremor I hadn't heard since he was a boy. "We need to talk, now." I wiped my flour-covered hands on my apron. "Well, hello to you too. Would either of you like a cookie? They're still warm." "This isn't a social call," Olivia snapped from the doorway. I noticed she was clutching her purse like it contained state secrets. Derek paced my small living room, the floorboards creaking under his weight. The same boards that had once supported his first steps, his high school graduation party, the homecoming of my grandson Ethan. Now they groaned under the weight of whatever he'd come to say. "It's about Olivia," he finally blurted out, stopping to face me. "She's in trouble." I slowly lowered myself into my rocking chair, the one Frank had made for me before cancer took him 5 years ago. "What kind of trouble?" Derek glanced back at Olivia, who gave him a curt nod. He took a deep breath and went straight to the point. "Someone from Olivia's past is threatening her. They say they have information. Things that happened before we were married. If it gets out, I'll lose everything, Mom. My job at the firm, our house in Cherry Hill, maybe even custody of Ethan." My heart sank at the mention of my 12-year-old grandson, the only pure thing in this tangled web of a family. After several minutes of vague explanations and circular talking, Derek finally said what he'd come to say. "Mom, we need $300,000, and we need it now." He didn't phrase it as a question. Not, "Can you help us, or would you consider lending us money?" It was stated as an obligation, as if I had gold bars stashed under my threadbare carpet or diamonds sewn into my curtains. $300,000? I repeated, almost laughing at the absurdity. "Derek, I'm a retired schoolteacher living on a pension. Where on earth would I get that kind of money?" His face darkened. "The house is paid off. You could take out a reverse mortgage. This is my home. I said quietly. The only thing I have left. And we're your family, he countered, his voice rising. The only thing that should matter. When I asked why they thought I should surrender my security, my future, my home, my son looked down at his expensive shoes and uttered words I never thought I'd hear from the boy I raised. Because you owe it to us. The room seemed to tilt. Owe them? After everything I'd sacrificed? What are you talking about? My voice sounded foreign to my own ears. Olivia finally stepped fully into my house, her heels clicking against the hardwood like tiny hammers driving nails into a coffin. Don't play innocent, Margaret, she said, using my full name like a weapon. We both know what happened before Ethan was born. We both know what you did. In that moment, everything I knew as family shattered inside me like glass hitting concrete. The realization washed over me like ice water. They weren't asking for help. They were demanding my silence. Again. I looked at my son, the boy I'd raised alone after Frank's first heart attack left him disabled, the child I'd put through college by taking extra tutoring jobs and summer school positions, the man whose wedding I'd helped pay for by selling my mother's antique jewelry collection, and saw a stranger. Get out, I whispered. Mom, get out. My voice broke with the force of it, startling even myself. Derek's face contorted with anger. You don't understand what's at stake here. If you don't help us, everything falls apart. As he turned to leave, he delivered his parting shot. If you really loved your family, you'd know what to do. The door slammed behind them, rattling the family photos on my wall. One fell and cracked, the picture of Derek's college graduation. As I picked up the broken frame, I realized something that had been true for a very long time, but that I'd been too afraid to admit. I wasn't their family anymore. I was their bank account, their insurance policy, their secret keeper. And for the first time in my 71 years, I wondered what would happen if I simply stopped. That night, sleep eluded me completely. The rain that had started earlier in the day had transformed into a proper northeastern storm, with wind howling through the eaves of my little craftsman home, like a mourning widow. How fitting, I thought bitterly, as I rocked back and forth in Frank's old chair, my eyes fixed on his portrait above the fireplace. Frank would have known what to do. Frank never would have let things get this far. But Frank was gone, his warm smile now just oils on canvas, his strong hands just a memory that grew fainter with each passing year. The grandfather clock in the hallway, another one of Frank's handcrafted treasures, chimed 3 in the morning. I hadn't moved from the rocking chair in hours, my arthritis complaining with each gentle sway back and forth. The house creaked and settled around me like an old friend sharing my insomnia. My mind kept returning to Olivia. I remembered the day she first came to this very house, barely 22 years old, her expensive clothes unable to hide the slight swell of her belly. She'd been terrified then, not of me, but of the secret she carried. Derek had been in law school, his future stretching bright before him. They weren't even engaged yet. I made tea that day too, Earl Grey with a splash of milk, served in my mother's china cups, the fancy ones with the gold trim that I only used for special occasions, as if that could somehow bridge the vast gulf between her world and mine. Mrs. Sullivan, she had said, her voice trembling despite her obvious attempts to project confidence. I love your son, and I'm carrying his child. What I didn't tell her that day, what I've never told anyone, was that I already knew her secret. Not about the pregnancy, but something else. Something darker that could have destroyed her life, and by extension, my son's. I'd overheard a conversation between Olivia and her father at a charity event weeks earlier, a heated whispered argument that wasn't meant for anyone else's ears, about money that had disappeared, about records that had been taken care of, about a problem that had been handled permanently. I kept that secret for her, not because I loved Olivia, but because I loved my son, and later because I loved my grandson Ethan more than anything in this world. And now, 12 years later, she had the audacity to stand in my living room and treat it like a debt I owed, like I'd been doing her a favor all these years by staying silent. It wasn't a favor. It was a burden that grew heavier with each passing year. It was blackmail, plain and simple. Maybe it had been from the very beginning. A flash of lightning illuminated my small living room, casting harsh shadows across the photographs lining my mantel. Derek's wedding photo, Ethan's first day of kindergarten, the 4 of us at Niagara Falls 3 summers ago, the last vacation we took together before everything started to change. Derek hadn't asked if I could help. He hadn't inquired about my finances or my health or whether I had enough to live on in my remaining years. He'd simply laid out his demands, as if I were a bank teller, and he was making a withdrawal from an account that was rightfully his. "If you really loved your family, you'd know what to do," he had said. Then he uttered words that keep ringing in my ears like church bells at a funeral. "If you don't pay, Olivia might end up taking her own life, and that would be on you, Mom. All on you." The weight of those words pressed down on me like a physical thing. The manipulation was so transparent, yet so effective. After all, what wouldn't a mother do to protect her child? Even a child who had grown into a man who could look her in the eyes and essentially threaten her with his wife's suicide. The silence in the house grew heavier, broken only by the ticking of Frank's clock and the occasional rumble of thunder. I found myself talking to Frank's portrait as dawn crept slowly across the eastern sky. "What happened to our boy, Frank? Where did we go wrong? Or was it just me? Did I spoil him after you got sick? Did I give too much? Not enough?" Frank's painted eyes offered no answers, just the same kind smile he'd worn even in his final days in the hospital, when the pain was at its worst. I looked down at my hands, spotted with age, the knuckles swollen from decades of grading papers, cooking meals, wiping tears, and later, changing Ethan's diapers when Olivia was too tired to get up with him. These hands had shaped young minds in a classroom for 40 years. They had held my husband's as he took his last breath. They had applauded at my son's graduation. And now they were empty, save for the warmth of my teacup and the weight of a decision that would change everything. The woman who had once been a respected English teacher, a devoted wife, a present and loving mother, was now just an old lady with an empty wallet and a past that nobody wanted to hear about anymore. Just a means to an end, a problem to be solved. As the first light of dawn filtered through my lace curtains, I made my decision, not with anger or bitterness, though God knows I felt plenty of both, but with the quiet resolve of a woman who had finally seen the truth laid bare before her. Some debts can never be repaid, and some secrets should never be kept. The following morning, I placed my old copper kettle on the stove as I had done every day for the past 50 years. The familiar ritual, filling it with exactly 2 cups of water, setting it on the front right burner, turning the knob to medium-high, brought a small comfort amid the chaos swirling through my mind. The methodical rhythm of routine was all I had left to cling to. While the water heated to a boil, I shuffled across my worn kitchen floor to the antique oak armoire that Frank had restored for our 5th anniversary. My fingers, stiff with arthritis and a poor night's sleep, traced the familiar patterns in the wood before grasping the tarnished brass handle. The hinges creaked in protest as I pulled the door open. Frank had always meant to oil them, but never got around to it. Just one of 1,000 small projects left forever unfinished when cancer claimed him. From the bottom shelf, behind a stack of photo albums I hadn't had the heart to look through in years, I pulled out my blue Samsonite suitcase. The color had faded to a muted periwinkle, and the corners were scuffed from decades of use. This was the same suitcase I had packed at 19 when I fled my father's house after he forbade me from attending college. The same suitcase I'd carried to my first teaching job in Allentown. The same one Frank and I had taken on our honeymoon to Cape May. It seemed fitting that it would accompany me now, on what might be my final journey. The kettle began to whistle, a high, thin sound that mirrored the tension coursing through me. I moved it from the burner with practiced ease, and let my tea steep in the chipped mug Derek had made for me in 2nd grade. "World's greatest mom," it proclaimed in uneven, childish letters. The irony wasn't lost on me. As I sipped my tea, Earl Grey, no milk, 1 sugar, I contemplated what to pack. Not much, I decided. Some clothes, toiletries, my blood pressure medication, my social security card and birth certificate, the small stack of savings bonds I kept in my bedside drawer, Frank's pocket watch, the silver locket containing a lock of Ethan's baby hair. I moved methodically through the house, selecting items with care, each one a deliberate choice rather than a panicked grab. This wasn't a rash decision made in the heat of emotion. No, this was clarity after years of fog, understanding after years of confusion, purpose after years of being used. Before zipping the suitcase closed, I took one last item from my desk, my monogrammed stationery set, a retirement gift from my colleagues at Scranton East High School. I sat at my kitchen table, the morning light streaming through the gingham curtains, and began to write. This wasn't a goodbye letter. It wasn't a tearful explanation or a desperate plea for understanding. This was something else entirely, a declaration of war. My hand, steady now despite everything, formed just one sentence in my precise teacher's script. You know what you've done, and you know what I'm capable of. I folded the creamy paper precisely, slipped it into an envelope and sealed it with deliberate pressure. No name on the front. None was needed. I placed it underneath the cookie jar, the ceramic one shaped like a fat ginger cat that Ethan had given me for Christmas 3 years ago. They would find it eventually. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 9 as I zipped my suitcase closed with finality. Outside, a fine mist had replaced yesterday's downpour, as if the sky too had exhausted its rage and settled into quiet determination. I slipped into my beige trench coat, not the warmest but the most anonymous of my outerwear, and knotted a floral scarf around my neck. My reflection in the hallway mirror showed a woman I barely recognized. Straight-backed, clear-eyed, resolute, the fearful grandmother of yesterday was gone. In her place stood a woman with nothing left to lose, and that made her dangerous. With one last glance at Frank's portrait, I whispered, "Watch over me, love. I'm finally doing what I should have done years ago." Instead of exiting through the front door, where nosy Mrs. Abernathy across the street might spot me, I slipped out through the back kitchen door. The latch clicked softly behind me, a sound of finality that sent a shiver down my spine despite the warmth of my coat. My yard was small but had always been my pride and joy. The hydrangeas I'd nurtured for decades, the bird bath Frank had installed on our 20th anniversary, the maple tree we'd planted when Derek was born, all of it soaked in memories, all of it now behind me, perhaps forever. I cut through the side gate and took the back alley that ran behind our row of modest homes. The suitcase bumped awkwardly against my leg as I walked, its weight pulling on my shoulder. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. To pause would be to doubt, and doubt would lead me right back to that kitchen, to that life, to those chains. The fine mist dampened my hair and beaded on my coat as I made my way toward the Scranton bus terminal. It was a 1.5-mile walk. No small feat for a woman my age with arthritic knees, but each step felt lighter than the last. Each step took me further from obligation and closer to freedom. The bus driver, a heavy-set man with salt and pepper stubble, looked at me with poorly disguised pity as I climbed aboard. I suppose he thought I was one of those abandoned old ladies you hear about on the news, discarded by family, heading to some state-funded facility to live out my remaining years in institutional neglect. But he was wrong. I wasn't running because I had been abandoned. I was running because I still had enough dignity left to choose my own path. And I had one final card to play in this twisted game my family had forced me into. As the bus pulled away from the terminal, I didn't look back at the city that had been my home for 7 decades. Instead, I looked forward, toward an uncertain future that for the first time in years belonged entirely to me. I chose a destination where no one would think to look for me, the forgotten seaside village of Westport, Connecticut, where my sister Elaine had lived before cancer claimed her 3 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. Cancer had taken both my husband and my only sibling within 2 years of each other. Sometimes I wondered if the disease wasn't somehow attracted to those I loved most, like a predator singling out members of a herd. The bus ride took nearly 4 hours, winding through small towns and stretches of New England countryside adorned in autumn's finest colors. The vibrant reds and golds of the trees blurred through my window, a stark contrast to the gray uncertainty of my future. I dozed intermittently, startling awake each time with momentary confusion before reality crashed back over me like a cold wave. Westport greeted me with the distinct scent of saltwater and decay that all aging coastal towns seem to share. The off-season emptiness added to its ghost town feel. Shuttered ice cream stands, vacant beach parking lots, and wind-battered "see you next summer" signs that had weathered another season alone. I took a room at the Shoreline Motel, a faded 2-story establishment with peeling blue paint and a flickering neon sign missing the letter O. The desk clerk barely looked up from her romance novel as I paid cash for a week's stay. $65 a night, highway robbery for what amounted to 4 walls, a sagging queen bed, and a bathroom with suspicious rust stains. But beggars can't be choosers, and I was, for all intents and purposes, a beggar now. The room smelled of industrial cleaner attempting to mask decades of cigarette smoke and disappointment. I placed my suitcase on the luggage rack, its vinyl straps stretched and worn, and sat heavily on the edge of the bed, the springs protesting beneath me. For the first time since leaving Scranton, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I had done. I had walked away from my home of 43 years. I had left behind Frank's workshop in the basement, still arranged exactly as it was the day he went into the hospital for the last time. I had abandoned the garden I tended with religious devotion every spring. I had fled from the only life I had ever known, all because the people who should have protected me had decided I was more valuable as a resource than as a mother, a grandmother, a human being with dignity and worth beyond my financial means. The tears came then, hot and relentless, the kind that rack your entire body and leave you gasping for breath. I cried for the woman I used to be, for the family I thought I had, for the future I'd envisioned spending my final years surrounded by love rather than exploitation. I cried until there was nothing left, until I was hollow and spent, curled on that strange bed in a strange town where no one knew my name. When the storm of emotion finally passed, I washed my face with cold water from the rust-stained sink and stared at my reflection in the spotted mirror. The woman who gazed back at me looked older than her 71 years, with puffy eyes and lines of exhaustion etched deeply around her mouth. But there was something else there too, a hardness that hadn't been present before, a resolve. I sat at the small desk by the window and removed a spiral notebook and pen from my suitcase. Then I began to write, everything I remembered, everything I had kept hidden for years, the truth that had been festering inside me like an infected wound. The truth was that Olivia had committed a crime when she was young. Not just any crime, something that had left blood on her hands, something that had required a cover-up, something that had drawn me in as an unwilling accomplice in order to protect my unborn grandchild. It had happened before she and Derek were married, during a weekend when they'd visited her family's lake house in the Poconos. I wasn't there. I only heard the story afterward, pieced together from frantic late-night phone calls and tearful confessions in my kitchen. There had been an argument with a local boy, the son of the caretaker who maintained the property during the off-season. Words had been exchanged, threats made, and then, according to Olivia, an accident. She claimed she had pushed him away from her in self-defense and he had fallen, striking his head on the corner of a stone fireplace. But the way Derek described the scene when he arrived, the amount of blood, the position of the body, the obvious signs of a struggle throughout the room, had always made me wonder if there wasn't more to the story than Olivia had admitted. What followed was a nightmare of hushed phone calls, hastily arranged cleaners, and a substantial payment to the caretaker's family, described as compensation for their loss, but understood by all to be hush money. Olivia's father handled most of it, leveraging his connections and considerable financial resources to ensure the matter disappeared. I became involved when Derek, panicked and desperate, confessed everything to me, seeking advice, absolution, anything to ease the crushing weight of complicity. And I, God help me, had counseled silence, to protect my son, to protect the unborn child Olivia was carrying, to protect my own moral conscience from the knowledge that I was aiding in concealing a possible homicide. At the time, I swore I would never breathe a word of it to anyone. But now, that $300,000 debt had a different name: blackmail. Someone knew. Someone was threatening to expose not just Olivia, but all of us who had helped conceal what happened that night. And if they did, it wouldn't just be Olivia who would fall. It would be Derek, for helping hide evidence. It would be me, for my silence. The only innocent one was Ethan, who would bear the crushing weight of his family's crimes regardless. As I wrote, my phone buzzed with messages. I had turned it to silent mode, but I could see the notifications lighting up my screen. Some were from Derek, increasingly frantic, alternating between pleading and threatening. But others were from unknown numbers, containing messages that chilled me to the bone. Running away isn't enough, Margaret. You should know better than to think you can escape this. And one that contained just a single word: traitor. I turned off my phone and slipped it into the drawer of the bedside table, underneath the obligatory Gideon Bible. Whoever was sending those messages, whether it was Olivia, her father, or the mysterious blackmailer, would have to wait. I had a story to finish writing, a truth to unbury, a life to reclaim. Outside my window, gulls cried as they wheeled above the deserted beach, their mournful calls a fitting soundtrack to my grim task. As afternoon faded into evening, I wrote by the harsh light of a bedside lamp, exorcising demons with each word committed to paper. Sunday morning dawned with a persistent drizzle that veiled the world outside my motel window in a gray shroud. I had been in Westport for nearly a week, venturing out only for necessities. A sandwich from the deli down the street, a cheap toothbrush from the drugstore when I realized I'd forgotten mine, a paperback mystery novel to occupy my restless mind during sleepless nights. That morning, something pulled me from my self-imposed exile. Perhaps it was the church bells I could hear faintly in the distance, their somber peals cutting through the pattering rain. Or maybe it was the crushing weight of isolation that had settled over me like a heavy blanket, threatening to suffocate me with each passing day alone. I dressed carefully in the clothes I'd washed in the bathroom sink and hung to dry overnight. A navy skirt, a cream blouse, sensible shoes that wouldn't slip on the wet sidewalks. I hadn't been to Mass in years, not since Frank's funeral, if I was being honest with myself. But I craved the silence, the ritual, the momentary suspension of reality that sacred spaces provide. St. Mary's was a modest brick building with a white steeple that seemed to pierce the low-hanging clouds. Inside, the air was heavy with incense and centuries of whispered prayers. I slipped into a pew near the back, the smooth wood polished by generations of the faithful. The organist was playing something by Bach, the notes rising to the vaulted ceiling and wrapping around the rafters like vines. I didn't listen to the sermon. Instead, I closed my eyes and let the familiar cadence of the service wash over me. The rise and fall of collective voices, the rustle of pages turning in hymnals, the shuffle of feet moving toward communion. In that moment, I wasn't Margaret Sullivan, fugitive grandmother with a suitcase full of secrets. I was simply one more soul seeking solace in ancient traditions. After the service, I lingered in the vestibule, reluctant to return to the oppressive solitude of my motel room. A woman about my age approached, her silver hair neatly coiffed beneath a modest navy hat that matched her rain jacket. "You're new," she said, not unkindly. "I'm Margaret," I replied, offering my hand. "Just passing through." "Maggie Hamilton," she introduced herself with a warm smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "And everyone's just passing through, dear. The question is where we stop along the way." There was something about her, a quiet strength, an absence of judgment, that loosened the knot of tension I'd been carrying between my shoulder blades since leaving Scranton. When she invited me to join the church's Sunday potluck in the basement, I found myself accepting without hesitation. The church basement was warm and bright, a stark contrast to the gloomy day outside. Long tables covered in mismatched tablecloths held an assortment of casseroles, salads, and desserts that spoke of tradition and care. Children darted between the tables, their laughter a balm to my wounded spirit. Over paper plates loaded with tuna noodle casserole and ambrosia salad, Maggie told me about herself. Widowed 5 years earlier, mother of 3 grown children scattered across the country, and volunteer coordinator for St. Mary's outreach to the local children's home. "We're always short-handed," she mentioned casually as we sipped lukewarm coffee from styrofoam cups. "The children need consistent faces, you know. Adults they can count on to show up." I found myself nodding, thinking of Ethan and how his face would light up when I arrived for our weekly outings. Had it only been 2 weeks since I'd last seen him? It felt like a lifetime ago. "I'll be in town for a while," I heard myself saying. "I could help." Maggie's smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds. "Wonderful. We have a group going tomorrow afternoon. Just simple things, helping with homework, playing board games, listening to their stories." The next day, I found myself in a converted Victorian house on the edge of town, the peeling paint and sagging porch belying the warmth within. Harbor Light Children's Home housed 12 children between the ages of 6 and 16, some orphaned, others removed from unsafe homes, all carrying burdens far too heavy for their young shoulders. I was assigned to the kitchen, washing dishes alongside 2 teenage girls who eyed me warily at first. As we worked, I asked them about school, their favorite subjects, their dreams. Slowly, their monosyllabic answers expanded into stories and jokes. By the time the mountain of dishes was conquered, we were laughing together over my retelling of the time I'd accidentally used salt instead of sugar in my famous chocolate chip cookies. As days turned into a week, then 2, I established a routine. Mornings were spent in my motel room, writing everything I could remember about Olivia's crime and the subsequent cover-up. Afternoons found me at Harbor Light, where I graduated from dish duty to reading stories to the younger children and helping the older ones with their math homework. The work was exhausting in the best possible way. Each night I collapsed into bed, physically tired, but with a mind quieter than it had been in years. I was doing something purely good, something uncomplicated by family politics or ancient grudges or moral compromise. I was simply being useful to children who needed someone to show up consistently. It was during my third week in Westport, as I sat cross-legged on a worn carpet listening to 6-year-old Tommy stumble through green eggs and ham, that I caught a glimpse of myself in the decorative mirror hanging on the opposite wall. I barely recognized the woman reflected there, hair slightly disheveled from Tommy's enthusiastic page-turning, cheeks flushed with warmth, eyes alive with purpose. I looked nothing like the hollow-eyed specter who had checked into the Shoreline Motel. Later that afternoon, as I helped serve snacks in the dining hall, a small boy with serious brown eyes tugged at my cardigan. I'd seen him around but hadn't interacted with him directly. He was one of the newer arrivals, still wary and withdrawn. "You look sad sometimes," he observed, with the unfiltered honesty unique to children. "When you think nobody's watching." I knelt to meet his eyes, surprised by the perceptiveness of his comment. "Sometimes I am sad," I admitted. He nodded solemnly. "My grandma gets like that too. When people lie to her." The simple statement hit me with unexpected force. How could this child, without knowing anything about me, pierce straight to the heart of my situation? And in that moment I began to question who I had become. Was I the woman who had protected her family at any cost? Or was I the coward who had allowed a crime to go unpunished? As I walked back to my motel that rainy afternoon, these questions churned within me, and waiting in my mailbox at the front desk was an official-looking envelope that would force me to answer them once and for all. A letter from an attorney informing me that Olivia was indeed about to be exposed, and my name was included in the investigation. The letter trembled in my hands as I sat on the edge of my sagging motel bed. The embossed letterhead of Caldwell, Royce, and Mitchell, attorneys at law, seemed to burn into my vision as I read and reread the carefully worded paragraphs. The language was clinical, detached, as if they weren't discussing the implosion of multiple lives but merely an interesting legal puzzle to be solved. As a material witness in the matter of the death of Joseph Grayson on July 17, 2012. Joseph Grayson. After all these years, I finally knew his name. The caretaker's son. The boy who had died that night at the lake house. He had been 19 years old. Just 19. I had never allowed myself to think of him as a real person with a name, a history, dreams that died with him on that polished mahogany floor. New evidence has come to light suggesting foul play. My stomach clenched. What evidence? After all this time, what could possibly have surfaced? The lake house had been sold years ago. Olivia's father had made sure every trace of that night was professionally removed. The local police investigation had been perfunctory at best, concluded with suspicious haste. Your failure to report knowledge of a crime constitutes being an accessory after the fact. The attorney's words were clear. If I didn't cooperate, I would be considered complicit. If I did cooperate, I would be destroying my son's family. Either way, I lost. Either way, I became the villain in someone's story, Olivia's or this dead boy's. I folded the letter and slipped it back into its envelope, placing it beneath my Bible in the drawer. A futile gesture, as if holy words could somehow neutralize the poison contained within those pages. Then I went to the bathroom, turned on the shower to mask any sounds, and allowed myself to cry until my throat was raw and my eyes burned. When I emerged, my hair damp and my resolve slightly steadier, I found my phone blinking with a notification. Derek had sent a text, the first direct communication since I'd left. My heart leapt traitorously before I reminded myself of his last words to me. With trembling fingers, I opened the message. "Please, Mom. If you talk, you'll destroy all of us. Please." The simplicity of it, the lack of any greeting or signature, the absence of any inquiry about my well-being or whereabouts, it all confirmed what I already knew. I wasn't a mother to him anymore. I was a potential witness who needed to be managed. A liability. For the first time in weeks, I responded. The attorney's letter found me. They know Derek. His reply came almost instantly. Don't say anything. Dad would have protected us. The mention of Frank, the invocation of his memory as a weapon, ignited something in me. Frank would have protected our son, yes. But would he have protected a murderer? Would he have sacrificed his own integrity, his own soul, to cover up a crime that had stolen a young man's life and future? I wasn't so sure. The Frank I knew had been kind but also principled to his core. He had taught Derek that actions have consequences, that moral choices matter. What would Frank think of me now? of what I had become in my misguided attempt to protect our family. I didn't respond to Derek's text. Instead, I wrapped my cardigan more tightly around myself and headed out into the chill October evening. The walk to Harbor Light Children's Home took 15 minutes, each step a battle against the wind that had picked up, carrying the scent of impending snow. Maggie was in the kitchen when I arrived, her hands deep in a bowl of cookie dough, flour dusting her cheeks. She took one look at my face and sent one of the teenagers to take over the baking. "Come," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Let's have some tea." We sat in her small office, a converted pantry with just enough room for a desk, 2 chairs, and a hot plate for keeping her ever-present teapot warm. She didn't ask what was wrong, didn't push for confidences I wasn't ready to give. She simply poured Earl Grey into chipped mugs and waited. "Have you ever done something terrible?" I finally asked. "For what you thought were the right reasons?" Maggie's eyes, the soft blue of faded denim, held mine steadily. "Haven't we all? I don't mean small things, I mean something that changed lives, something you can't take back." She was quiet for a long moment, stirring her tea thoughtfully. "When my Tommy was 16, he got into some trouble. Bad crowd, worse choices. One night the police brought him home. He'd been caught joyriding in a stolen car. I listened, wondering where this story was leading. I covered for him," she continued. "Told them he'd been home with me all night. Lied straight to their faces." She smiled sadly. "I thought I was protecting him. 6 months later, he wrapped another stolen car around a tree. Nearly died, and I realized my protection had nearly killed him. What did you do?" "The hardest thing I've ever done. I let him face the consequences. Watched them take my baby away in handcuffs. Visited him every week in juvenile detention." Her eyes glistened with old pain. "It broke my heart, but it saved his life. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is allow the truth to have its day." We sat in silence after that, the only sound the distant laughter of children and the ticking of the ancient clock on Maggie's wall. I thought about her words, turning them over in my mind like smooth river stones. The most loving thing we can do is allow the truth to have its day. But whose truth? And at what cost? Back in my motel room that night, I checked my email for the first time in days. Among the spam and subscription notifications was a message from an address I didn't recognize, ethan.sullivan12@gmail.com. My grandson had created a secret email account. My heart pounded as I clicked to open it. "Grandma," it read, "I'm not supposed to be talking to you. Mom cries all the time. Dad is scary angry. They think I don't hear them fighting, but I do. Last night Mom said something about someone called Joey, and Dad threw a glass and it broke everywhere. I heard Dad say you might tell people what really happened, and Mom said if you do, she might as well kill herself. Dad said you abandoned us when we needed you most, but I don't think you would do that without a good reason. I miss you. Please tell me you're okay." The simple words tapped out by 12-year-old fingers broke something in me that I thought had already been broken. My precious Ethan, caught in the middle of this nightmare, trying to make sense of adult sins and secrets. "I'm okay," I typed back with trembling fingers. "And I love you more than all the stars in the sky. Nothing that's happening is your fault. The grown-ups have made some mistakes, and now we have to fix them. I'll explain everything someday when you're older. For now, just know that I'm thinking about you every minute." I hit send, then immediately wondered if I'd done the right thing. Should I have maintained radio silence? Would Olivia or Derek monitor his email? Would my message somehow make things worse for him? But one truth shone through all the swirling doubts and fears. The only innocent person in this entire sordid mess was Ethan. And somehow, some way I had to protect him. Not from the truth, but from the lies that had poisoned our family for so long. That night, I sat at the small desk by the window and began to write again. Not my memories this time, but my last will and testament. Not concerning money or property. I had precious little of either. But a full confession. Every detail I could remember about that night at the lake house. Every conversation. Every phone call. Every decision that led us to this moment. I sealed it in an envelope, addressed it simply "The Truth," and locked it in the motel safe. Someone would find it eventually. Whether I was alive to deal with the consequences remained to be seen. The courthouse in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania loomed before me, its stone facade darkened by the early morning drizzle. Built in the 1800s, the building had witnessed generations of justice and injustice, truth and deception. Today, It would witness mine. I smoothed my hands over my simple navy dress, the only respectable outfit I'd packed in my hasty departure from Scranton. The fabric was slightly wrinkled despite my best efforts with the motel room's ancient iron, but that seemed fitting somehow. I was wrinkled too, worn by time and circumstance, imperfect but present. My attorney, a court-appointed public defender named Ms. Winters with tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, waited for me at the top of the granite steps. We had spoken only twice before, once over the phone when I called to say I would cooperate with the investigation, and once yesterday in a brief prep meeting where she outlined what I should expect today. "Remember," she said now, her voice low as she guided me through security, "you're only here to give a deposition. This isn't a trial. Just answer truthfully and concisely. Don't volunteer information beyond what's asked." I nodded, though truthfully I hadn't decided yet what I would say when the moment came. The weight of my sealed confession, tucked into my handbag, seemed to pull at my shoulder like an anchor. The deposition room was smaller than I'd imagined, just a conference room with a long oak table, leather chairs, and wood-paneled walls adorned with portraits of stern-faced judges from centuries past. Their painted eyes seemed to follow me as I took my seat, as if they too were waiting to hear what version of the truth would emerge from my lips. A court reporter sat in the corner, her fingers poised over her stenotype machine. A video camera on a tripod pointed at the chair where I would sit. Everything would be recorded, transcribed, preserved. Whatever I said here today would become part of a permanent record. Ms. Winters arranged her files on the table before her with methodical precision. "The prosecutor will be here shortly," she murmured, "along with counsel for the other interested parties." Other interested parties. A euphemism for my son and his wife, for the family of Joseph Grayson, for everyone whose lives would be irrevocably changed by what happened in this room today. The door opened, and they filed in. First came a sharp-featured woman in a charcoal suit, the prosecutor, I presumed. Behind her was a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and the worn face of someone who had seen too much sorrow. Something in his eyes, a particular shade of hazel, made my breath catch. This must be Joseph's father, the caretaker who had lost his son and been paid to stay silent. And then, entering last, were Derek and Olivia. My son wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared fixedly at the table, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle twitching beneath his skin. Beside him, Olivia was a pale ghost of herself. She had lost weight since I'd last seen her. Her collarbones protruded sharply above the neckline of her conservative blouse. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, which darted nervously around the room before finally settling on me. In those eyes I saw not the arrogant daughter-in-law who had demanded my life savings, but a terrified woman facing the collapse of everything she had built. For a fleeting moment, I felt a stab of pity. The prosecutor introduced herself as Andrea Reyes and outlined the purpose of the deposition. Her voice faded to a buzz in my ears as I studied the faces around me. Derek, his eyes now fixed on some middle distance, his expression unreadable. Olivia, trembling almost imperceptibly, her manicured fingernails digging into her own palms. Joseph's father, Mr. Grayson, whose quiet dignity spoke volumes about the grief he had carried alone for 12 long years. And suddenly I knew what I had to do. "Mrs. Sullivan," the prosecutor's voice cut through my thoughts, "please state your full name for the record." "Margaret Eleanor Wilson Sullivan," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "And you understand that you're under oath and that your testimony today may be used in future legal proceedings?" "I do." What followed was a series of questions about my relationship with Olivia, with Derek, about the time period surrounding Joseph Grayson's death. I answered truthfully but carefully, watching Derek grow increasingly tense with each response. Then came the question I'd been dreading. "Mrs. Sullivan, did your daughter-in-law, Olivia Sullivan, ever discuss with you the events of July 17th, 2012, at the Sullivan Lake House in Pike County?" The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Derek's eyes finally met mine, pleading silently. Olivia had gone completely still, like a deer frozen in headlights. "Mr. Grayson leaned forward almost imperceptibly. I took a deep breath and looked directly at the prosecutor. "There are things that need to be judged," I said slowly, "but not by this court." A murmur ran through the room. The prosecutor's eyebrows rose sharply. "Mrs. Sullivan, please answer the question that was asked." Instead, I reached into my handbag and removed the sealed envelope containing my confession. I placed it carefully on the table and slid it not toward the prosecutor, but toward Ms. Winters. "I've prepared a complete statement," I said. "It contains everything I know about that night and the events that followed, but I will not speak it aloud today. Mrs. Sullivan," the prosecutor's voice sharpened, "I remind you that you are under oath." "I understand," I replied, "and I am not refusing to provide information. I'm simply choosing to provide it in written form, through my attorney." Ms. Winters, to her credit, recovered quickly from her surprise. "My client has the right to submit a written statement," she said. "We'll provide copies to all parties, of course." The prosecutor looked ready to object further, but something, perhaps the quiet dignity with which I sat, or perhaps simple curiosity about the contents of the envelope, stopped her. "Very well," she said after a moment. "We'll take a recess while this statement is copied and distributed. But be aware, Mrs. Sullivan, that I may have additional questions afterward." As the room emptied, Derek approached me. His face was ashen, his movements stiff as if he had aged decades in the span of an hour. "Why?" he whispered. "Why did you come back at all if you were just going to destroy us?" I looked up at my son, my only child, the boy I had read bedtime stories to, the teenager I had taught to drive, the man I had helped become who he was, and felt a profound sadness. "I came back because the truth matters," I said simply. "Because Joseph Grayson's life mattered. Because Ethan deserves to grow up in a home built on honesty, not secrets." Derek's eyes filled with tears. "You've saved us," he said, his voice breaking. "For now, but this will always hang over us. I'll never forget what you did today." As he turned to leave, I caught his arm. "No," I said softly. "You've already forgotten. A long time ago. You forgot who I was, who we were as a family." I watched him walk away, back straight, shoulders rigid with the effort of maintaining composure. In that moment I mourned, not for the family I was losing, but for the one I had thought we were, the one that had never truly existed. I left the courthouse alone, the weight of my decision settling around me like a cloak. The statement would be read. Investigations would continue. Justice, in whatever form it might take, would eventually find its way to Joseph Grayson, but I would not be there to witness it. My part in this story was finished. I returned to Westport as autumn surrendered to winter's first advances. The coastal town had transformed in my absence. Summer cottages boarded up tight against approaching storms, holiday decorations appearing in shop windows along Main Street, the boardwalk empty save for bundled locals walking their dogs along the wind-whipped shore. The air carried the sharp, clean scent of snow yet to fall, a promise of blanketed silence to come. Maggie was waiting for me at the bus station, her silver hair tucked beneath a hand-knitted red hat, a thermos of tea clutched in her mittened hands. I hadn't told her where I was going when I left for the deposition, only that I had unfinished business to attend to. Yet somehow she knew exactly when I would return, as if the universe had whispered my schedule into her ear during morning prayers. "You look different," she observed, passing me the thermos as we walked toward her ancient Volvo, lighter somehow. I took a sip of the tea, Earl Grey with a hint of honey, and considered her words. "I feel unfinished," I finally replied, like a book with pages still blank. Maggie nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Most stories worth telling are never truly finished," she said, unlocking the passenger door for me. "They just reach a point where the reader has to imagine the rest." She drove me not to the Shoreline Motel with its sagging beds and flickering neon, but to her own home, a small blue Cape Cod with white trim and window boxes still stubbornly displaying the last hardy pansies of the season. Inside, a fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the rich aroma of beef stew simmering on the stove enveloped me like an embrace. "The guest room is small," she said, leading me up a narrow staircase, "but the bed is comfortable, and the view of the harbor is worth the cramped quarters." I stood in the doorway of what would become my sanctuary for the coming months. A room with sloped ceilings, faded floral wallpaper, and a patchwork quilt spread across an iron bedstead. The window, as promised, offered a sweeping view of Westport Harbor, its waters steel gray beneath the winter sky, fishing boats bobbing gently at their moorings. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, turning to face my unexpected benefactor. "You barely know me." Maggie's eyes crinkled at the corners as she smiled. "I know enough," she said simply. "I know you're someone who's trying to do the right thing even when it hurts. That's enough for me." That night, after a meal that was the first home-cooked food I'd tasted since leaving Scranton, we sat by the fire, and I told her everything. The words poured out of me like water from a broken dam. Olivia's crime, the cover-up, my complicity, Derek's betrayal, the impossible choice I'd faced in that deposition room. Maggie listened without judgment, her knitting needles clicking a gentle rhythm as I unburdened my soul. When I finished, the fire had burned low and my throat was raw from talking. Maggie set aside her knitting, a child's hat in cheerful yellow yarn, and poured us each a small glass of sherry from a crystal decanter that had belonged to her grandmother. "So what happens now?" she asked, passing me a glass. I took a sip, letting the sweet warmth spread through me before answering. "I don't know. The prosecutor has my statement. What they do with it is beyond my control. And your son? Your grandson?" The mention of Ethan sent a familiar pang through my heart. Derek sent me a text after the deposition. Just 2 words. "Thank you." I don't know what that means. If he's grateful I didn't testify aloud, or if he understands why I had to provide the written statement. I sighed, watching the firelight play through the amber liquid in my glass. As for Ethan, I don't know if I'll ever see him again. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm I hadn't known I craved. Mornings were spent helping Maggie with her volunteer work, not just at Harbor Light, but at the community food pantry, the literacy center, the senior residence where we led chair yoga classes that left us all breathless with laughter. Afternoons I had to myself, for long walks along the winter beach or hours spent in the town library, losing myself in other people's stories when my own became too heavy to carry. December arrived with a nor'easter that battered the coast for 3 days, leaving behind 8 inches of snow and power outages across town. Maggie and I played gin rummy by candlelight, wrapped in every sweater we owned, eating peanut butter sandwiches and telling ghost stories like schoolgirls at a sleepover. It was during that storm that Derek wrote to me, a proper letter this time, not a text, sent to Maggie's address, through what must have been considerable detective work on his part. "Olivia has checked herself into a treatment center," he wrote in his precise handwriting, so like Frank's it made my heart catch. "The prosecutor has decided not to pursue charges against her based on your statement and additional evidence that's come to light. Instead, she'll be required to complete an intensive therapy program and perform community service." Mr. Grayson, Joseph's father, apparently advocated for leniency. He said his son wouldn't want more lives ruined. I read those words through tears, thinking of the quiet dignity in Mr. Grayson's face, the grace it must have taken to choose compassion over vengeance. Derek's letter continued, growing more personal with each paragraph, as if the act of writing had broken through some barrier in his heart. He apologized for his behavior, for the demands he'd made, for forgetting that I was his mother first and foremost, not a solution to his problems. He wrote of his own therapy sessions, of difficult conversations with Olivia about their marriage, about the kind of parents they wanted to be for Ethan, and at the very end, almost as an afterthought, "Ethan asks about you constantly. He wants to know if he can visit during Christmas break." Maggie found me on the window seat, the letter clutched to my chest, tears streaming unchecked down my face. Wordlessly, she sat beside me, placing an arm around my shoulders. "He's coming," I whispered. "My grandson is coming for Christmas." When Ethan arrived 2 weeks later, bundled in a new parka and carrying a duffel bag emblazoned with his school logo, I barely recognized him. Had he grown taller in the months since I'd seen him last? His voice deeper? Or was it something else? A new seriousness in his eyes, a maturity born from witnessing adult failings up close. But when he threw his arms around me, burying his face in my shoulder the way he had since he was a toddler, he was simply my Ethan again, my precious boy, smelling of winter air and the chocolate chip cookies I'd sent him every birthday since he was old enough to receive mail. "I missed you, Grandma," he said, his voice muffled against my sweater. "So much." "I missed you too, sweetheart," I replied, stroking his hair, afraid to let go lest he disappear again. More than all the stars in the sky. The week that followed was a gift I hadn't dared hope for. Building snowmen on the beach, baking Christmas cookies in Maggie's kitchen, reading A Christmas Carol aloud by the fire, 1 chapter each night before bed. We didn't talk about his parents or the events that had separated us. There would be time for those conversations in the years to come, when he was old enough to understand the complexities of adult mistakes and redemption. Today, at 73, I live in a small apartment above the bookstore where I work part-time in downtown Westport. My walls are adorned with Ethan's school photos, artwork from the children at Harbor Light, and a framed picture of Maggie and me on the boardwalk, our arms linked, faces creased with laughter. Derek visits occasionally, our relationship mending slowly, one careful conversation at a time. Olivia and I maintain a polite distance, bound by mutual respect if not affection. And if you ask me whether it was worth it, walking away from everything I knew to face an uncertain future alone, I would answer without hesitation, not running away, surviving. And surviving is the most beautiful form of revenge. Because I've learned that forgiveness isn't a gift you give to someone else. It's a place where you live when you decide not to carry the weight of others' guilt anymore. It's the freedom that comes from choosing truth over comfort, integrity over security. It's waking up each morning knowing that whatever else I've lost, I've kept the one thing that truly matters. The woman who looks back at me from the mirror each morning, her eyes clear, her conscience unburdened, her heart open to whatever story remains to be written on the blank pages ahead. Family. They say it's everything. But what happens when the people who should protect you become the ones you need protection from? At 71, I was forced to make an impossible choice between enabling a dangerous lie and standing up for what I knew was right, even if it meant losing everything. What would you have done? Would you have surrendered your home, your security, your dignity to protect a secret that was never yours to keep? Or would you have found the courage to walk away? Sometimes the most profound act of love isn't staying, it's leaving. It's recognizing when loyalty has become a prison, when sacrifice has become surrender. I lost my son, my home, and the life I had built over 7 decades. But I found something far more precious: myself. The truth is, forgiveness isn't a gift you give someone else. It's a place you live when you decide not to carry the weight of others' guilt anymore. It's the freedom that comes from choosing truth over comfort, integrity over security. If this story touched your heart, remember that you always have choices even when it seems like you don't. You are never too old to start over, never too broken to rebuild. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that message today. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage and resilience in the face of life's impossible choices. And leave a comment below. I'd love to know what part of my journey resonated with you most. Because in sharing our stories, we find not just understanding, but the strength to write new endings for ourselves.